If you have a Bible today, go ahead and turn to 2 Corinthians. Now, in case you are a guest with us today, we've just been going now for months. We've just been going verse by verse through the scriptures, and I have to admit to you, I've had an absolute blast with it, because these are some of these parts of the scripture of the Bible I've obviously read, but I have never actually taught on them, because the great part about verse by verse is that you don't miss or skip anything, right? And so all of us have our pet agendas, all of us have our pet things that we like to talk about, right? And including yours truly. And the great part about verse by verse is that you're gonna go through the whole thing. So, but just so you understand, today's title is authentic. Okay, authentic. Authentic means that it is what it says that it is, right? Inauthentic or hypocritical, the opposite of authentic is probably hypocritical. Therefore, something portrays itself, and in reality, that's not what it is. So authentic is something that is real. In fact, our culture, our world, right, but especially the place in which we live, screams out for something to be real, because it seems like nothing really is, right? Guys, our whole world is about portraying yourself as something that you're not. I mean, the whole social media, is that not what it is? It's a portrayal of something that you're not, right? And sometimes you are, right? But in reality, you don't put the failures on your social media, right? And so, well, I know a lot of you never fail, but you know what I'm talking about, right? And so, but our world screams out for the authentic. Will somebody just be who they say they are? And guys, that's who God's called us to be, if we're His. Great question today is, are we His? And if you are His, then He's not so much called you to act like He's called you to act. He's called you to be who He's called you to be. And whenever we turn it into about what we do, then in reality it becomes a self-effort thing, or it really doesn't matter who I am as long as this is who people think I am. And that's a slippery slope. That's an ugly place to go. The Pharisees were that way. And so the authentic thought about today, you'll see it, Paul's pretty clear. I want to tell you, I really want you to understand the context of this one. Because if you get why Paul wrote this, because some of them it's like weird, like, Paul, why would you say that? But if you don't understand the context, then it makes perfect sense. But if you just go ahead and show me, obviously God had changed. Paul's life was changed by who Christ is, what He came to do, and it was an amazing transformation. And so God called Paul to start churches. And what I mean by that, He called them in the Gentile world, not so much the Jewish world, but the Gentile world. And so he went around from place to place, and God used him to do incredible things. So I want you to understand that Paul started this church at Corinth. And Corinth was a decadent place, which we don't have time to go into. We've talked about it in weeks past. But he started it, and God did a real work there, right? People's lives were changed. It was a pretty neat thing. And so Paul stayed there, 20 months or so, I think the scripture tells us. And he worked with them, and he grew them, and all that what happened. And then Paul moved on, right, to the next place, put leadership in place and different things. But while Paul was gone, a lot happened, we've talked about this, but while Paul was gone, there were some people that came in after him. And obviously the church at Corinth had gotten a little bit larger. And these guys came in, and they claimed all kinds of things. This is the main thing you need to hear, because when you get the context, the rest of it's like, oh, that makes perfect sense. So these guys came in, and they claimed to be They claimed to be something more, a whole lot more than they really were. They claimed to be apostles, right, of Christ, and they claimed to be sent from those who were in Jerusalem, and they claimed to, that yes, you needed Christ, but we have more information for you. Is that you're not ever going to know everything you need to know unless we tell you, right? So it was kind of like this. It was kind of like this thing, right? And in order for them to get credibility, they had to beat up Paul, if you will, right? They had to talk bad about him and make him seem insignificant. And so that's what happened. And they were just good enough. They were obviously excellent communicators, and they had a lot of emotionalism and different things because they were into this Jewish type mysticism. And so again, there's not enough time to go into all of it. But it really was leading these Corinthian people down the wrong road. They're believers down the wrong road. So Paul confronted them, and they repented. They were like, Paul, you're right. And so Paul writes them a letter, and it's 2 Corinthians. And chapter 11, this is interesting. The whole reason for chapter 11 is to give them the ability to be able to see that which was not real, so that they wouldn't be duped again. You see, guys, there are con artists everywhere. Even among what we would call church world, spiritual world, con artists are everywhere. Therefore, those who portray themselves as something that they're not. And the easiest ones to be duped by are those, because so few people, and I don't mean this bad, but so few people really know what they believe. Am I making sense? And so it's easy to fall into these pits, because until you've grown, it's hard to know the real from the not real. It's hard to know those things unless you're real familiar with that which is real. And so Paul teaches these Corinthians so that they can learn from what just happened to them. And I just want you to see it. Once you know what the context is, you start reading that and you're going, I know exactly why he's saying that. Oh, that makes sense. So again, that has been kind of the passion for this series through 2 Corinthians. Let's just let it speak, right? And I'm trying real hard just to explain it to you so everybody can understand, right? So let's walk down through it. Now, I have chapter 11 broken down into three parts. Number one is what I'm going to call loyalty to Christ. Now, it makes perfect sense what Paul is saying here, so let's jump into it. Loyalty to Christ, though, and he uses an illustration, but let's jump to it and find out what the illustration is, right? All right, chapter 11, verse 1. He said, I wish you would bear with me in a little foolishness. So in other words, he's going to use an illustration that's maybe a little foolish, all right? But it proves a point, all right? So do bear with me. I think that's interesting what he says, right? So, but what is he doing? All right, well, and this was the statement that's really kind of foolish, right? This is what he's saying. For I feel, Paul's talking about himself, I feel a divine jealousy for you. Okay, that's weird. If you don't know what he's talking about, that's weird. Because how can Paul be divinely jealous about these folks? Okay, but he's using an analogy and an illustration. It'll make good sense in just a minute. All right, here we go. All right, since I betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. Okay, again, weird, unless you know what he's talking about, because this analogy is all over the scriptures, and it's the marriage analogy. And you have to understand the context of the marriage, especially the Jewish marriage and the marriages of that time. What happened is that you had a betrothal period. You cannot compare anything in our culture to what he's talking about here. Because our culture is dating, and then you get engaged, and then you get married, but the engagement is just kind of like hyped up dating. Y'all know what I'm saying? And it has no bearing on what it means to be betrothed. Okay, so let's talk about betrothal. Betrothal is that time where actually you're married, all right? In other words, to break a betrothal, you have to get a divorce. Okay? To break an engagement, you just give the ring back. All right? But this is different. This is like something that has been made. And so a lot of times in this culture, these betrothal, they've been betrothed since they were kids. Right? I know, that sounds weird to you, but I always like to ask the question, whenever you make fun of something else, how's our system working? That becomes the question you ask yourself, right? But that's another message for another time. So what is he talking about? Well, what happens is, let me just explain it to you, is that the betrothal, it usually lasted about a year. And so what would happen, everybody would come together, right? All the families, right? And they would have this little ceremony and whatever, and the time would begin. And the groom, right, would leave, and he would go get a place ready for his new family. Usually what it meant is that they would add on to a family compound. I know that sounds weird, but that, again, you just didn't have apartments at that time. And so usually your families all stayed together, and that's just the way it was. And usually they would just add on to the family compound, right? That's why sometimes these families had huge places, because they kept adding on. So this guy would go away, right? And he would start preparing, right? And then he would come back, right? And they would have this wedding celebration, right? And then sometimes it would last a few days, there would be a lot of feasting, a lot of, things like that. And then he would take her back to the place he'd prepared, and then they would consummate the marriage, and then they would begin their new family. Now, Jesus used this analogy quite a bit. In fact, all through the scriptures, it talks about that Christ, obviously the bridegroom, right, or the groom, and again, it's this analogy, and that those of us that are his, that is his church, is known as the bride of Christ. But you have to get your mind away from the physical part of what marriage is to trying to help you understand this picture of what he's talking about. But the picture is that you're his. You're his. That's what he's trying to get across here. This is what he wants you to know and to understand. So Paul says, listen, I shared Christ with you. I brought the gospel to you, right? And I want you to remain loyal to who Christ is. Don't be led astray by every smooth talker that comes by. This is what he's saying. And then you're beginning to go, okay, that makes perfect sense. All right, so even in the Bible, the scripture teaches that those of us that are his, is that even it says that Christ has gone away, right? In my Father's house are many rooms or mansions, right? But in reality, it's rooms. Therefore, I go to prepare a place for you. So in this analogy, Christ has gone away and then he returns. And in the book of Revelation, it talks about this big marriage feast, right? That happens afterwards. So those that are his. That's why I use that term so often. I use the word Christian, most people don't even know what I'm talking about, because that's gotten so weird, because it can mean so many things. The question is really, are you his? Right? If you're a believer today, you are. That's what it says, right? You're his. So therefore, remain his, be loyal to who he is, because there will be many that will come along, right? That will catch your eye, if you will. We're not talking about marriage here. See, the reason that this is so weird in our culture, because this culture in which you and I live is sexually obsessed. All right? I mean, does anybody disagree, all right? And so that's what makes this analogy weird to so many. But see, the scripture talks about in fact, one of the oldest commandments in the scriptures is the man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So therefore, there's a joining, there is a oneness. And so what Christ is saying by that is that we're his, and that we will be, and there will be one with Christ in this picture. It's an amazing thing when you think about what he's talking about here. Right? So understanding what it means to be his, he goes on to say, but I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, right, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. In other words, there's been good-looking, smooth talkers come by and you've been tempted. All right? You get what he's saying to them, right? They're telling you how wonderful you are, how beautiful you are, whatever. They're telling you all these things and they're making promises to you, and it's the immature that run after the shiny new toy all the time, right? That's the picture. And you see it in churches today. You see people go running towards shiny new toys, right? They run all over the place, but after they get there, they find out it's not near what they thought it was. So what Paul is trying to say to them, listen, be careful how you listen to these people come in and they brag about themselves, that they have all the answers and that you need them or you're going to be left out and all these other things that they were saying. This is where he's going. Paul says, listen, I just want you to have a sincere, authentic relationship with Christ. I've heard people tell me, and I feel for them because they say, well, I've got all my bases covered. I believe in Christ, but I also believe in, they start listing all this other stuff. All that shows me is that they don't know Christ. Are you hearing me? All right, you're either his or you're not his. You see, guys, if you're going to be his, remember, you will never fit into the politically correct crowd. It just won't happen. It can't happen. Let me just give you one little tiny for instance. Jesus made a statement. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except they come through me. Now, Jesus that's either the truth or that's not the truth. Right? That's either the truth or it's not the truth. Interesting. All right? For if someone comes, this is what Paul has continued to say. All right? For somebody comes and proclaims another Jesus, all right, than the one that we proclaimed, or receive a different spirit from the one you received, or if you accept a different gospel from the one you accepted. And he goes on to say, listen, you put up with this. In other words, let's all just have a group hug, right? Oh, what you believe is just as right as what I believe, and all this other garbage, right? And it sounds good, but remember, sounding good doesn't mean it's the truth. And this is what he's saying. You are putting up with this, right? And maybe either a little bit are flattered by it, right? Now look at this next verse. He says, indeed. Right? I love that word, indeed. Nobody really knows what it means. All right? Oh, indeed. Okay. What does that mean? All right, here we go. All right. Indeed, he says, I consider that I am not the least inferior to these super apostles. Well, sarcasm, all right, from Paul. Are you hearing him? So, what is he saying to them? Well, this tells you what they've been saying. These super apostles have been lowering Paul a little bit, bless Paul's heart, he's just a redneck apostle. All right, I can say that because I'm from Tennessee, right? Bless his heart, he just doesn't know or get it. I mean, his heart's in the right place, so anyway, you see what's happening to guys, that's the way our world works. People go around boasting about who they are, what they have, what they can do in order to make themselves and to separate themselves, then they down everybody else. Right? that's what they were doing. It just makes sense. In fact, he goes on to say, listen, I know what they're saying, but I'm not in the least bit inferior to these, quote, super apostles or apostles on steroids, whatever you want to call them, right? Now, this is interesting. Look at verse 6. Even if I am unskilled in speaking. Now, see, I don't know about you, but if you've been a believer very long, all right? Now, if you haven't been, that's fine. Just keep hanging on, keep listening. But if you've been a believer very long, I mean, Paul is one of those guys you have these images of in your mind, what he would be like. You know, I've told you before, I've kind of always thought he, kind of like the John Wayne of the Christian world, And he would come in and he would stand up and give these great speeches or sermons or whatever you want to call them, and it would just make such an impact. But we find out here that Paul's not a very good communicator, right? So what's he saying? Why is he saying this? Because these super apostles had come in and had said, well, God, the guy is boring as they can be. I mean, he can't even communicate very well. Listen to me. I think there are great skills at communication, and I think it's an effective tool, but it also can be used as a weapon. And it has been used, communication has been used as a weapon down through the ages. Because I have watched and seen, I try not to do it even though I know how. I've seen lots of people be able to speak in such a way, and they have, and they use humor, and they use emotion, and they use all kinds of things, and you get a crowd all hyped up, and they will just about believe anything you tell them from then on. I mean, you can tell them all kinds of things, and then they all clap. And it's an amazing thing. Therefore, communication is one of the greatest ways, right, if you know how to do it, to share lies and to make them believable. Interesting, huh? We see politicians do it all the time. I mean, I don't want to be ugly, but we do we not? So Paul is saying to this, listen, he's told them many times, guys, when I went into an area, he says it was not enticing words that made the difference. He said, but I just shared the truth with them. And God took that truth, opened their eyes, and changed their lives. Treasures in jars of clay, right? So therefore, I'm not motivating a crowd, right, to try to live for Christ. I'm teaching them how Christ can live in them and then through them. For those of you who have ears to hear. So Paul is talking about manipulation. Paul's talking about these charismatic, if you will, gifted personality trait type people came in and they did these great things, but they're leading you astray, right? Because it feels right, it sounds right. But in any particular situation, it's amazing what can happen, right? So he goes on to say, listen, but he said, even if I'm unskilled in speaking, I'm not so in knowledge. Indeed, in every way, we have made this plain to you in all things. Paul is telling them, listen, all I really cared about was that you understood. Just made it plain, right? That's a passion of mine. Guys, I went to church most of my life, and I'd scratch my head and say, I don't know what the guy was talking about. But it is, and again, I'm not saying I always get there, but my passion, desire is for you to understand, right? And then if God works in your life, then we're going to give him the glory for it, right? Because it's him, it's his word, let's do what he's called us to do. But I just want you to hear then what he's talking about. You know, again, I've never tried to be critical, and I'm not going to beat on people and be ultra judgmental. I found out that type of pride can really get you into trouble, right? But one thing that really, really gets to me are these people on television. right? The ones who are doing spiritual things, not all of them, but there are some of them that are excellent. But, every once in a while, I don't do it often because I keep throwing my shoe at the television, But, some of them will be on television and they'll be saying all these things, and it's usually hyped up and it's usually emotional, and it's, and I remember watching about 10 minutes before the shoe flew at the television. And I don't know, I counted a dozen errors in 10 minutes. When I say errors, I mean just lies, the opposite of what Scripture teaches. And yet it's couched in spiritualism, and folks are swallowing it that don't understand, that don't see. This is what Paul's talking about, right? Paul says, I don't care, even if I'm not a great communicator. The one thing Paul was real good at, he wasn't good at communication orally, but he was real good at the pen. He could write, right? Remember we talked about how he said that, but he's real bold writing, but he's real humble when he's with you, that kind of thing, all right? Good. All right, so number one is just loyalty to Christ, all right? Loyalty to Christ. Number two is characteristics of a true believer. Now, when I was putting this message together, I threw believer in there because, as always, I like for us to all think about this, right? As we look at ourselves, what are some of the characteristics of being his? But in reality, you could substitute the word believer for the word leader. Because Paul is saying, how do you know? How do you know that the guy up there who is sharing and teaching is what he says that he is? Good question. That's what he talks about here, right? That's what he talks about. Now, this is interesting, all right? I just want you to see what he's saying. All right, so characteristics of a true believer or a true leader, if you will. All right, verse 7, he said, basically Paul asked the question, he says, or did I commit a sin in humbling myself? All right, there's another charge that these super apostles had for Paul. Well, the guy comes in here, he can't speak, and he has no self-confidence. Right? These are kind of some of the things that they were saying about him. And so he goes on to say, listen, did I commit a sin by humbling myself? You see, guys, that's the world you and I live in. And that's the world that Paul lived in. It hasn't changed. We hear all the time, is that you have to be confident in yourself. That's all you hear. Now, this may sound really weird to you, but when you're a believer, you kind of do the opposite of what everybody else around you does. That's why you're never going to fit in. In fact, the thought here is that self-confidence is not who God's called you to be. In fact, he's called you to put your confidence in him. So therefore, the less self-confidence you have, the better. Doesn't that sound weird? And yet, the more self-confidence you have, the more you rely on yourself for what you need and what you want to do. It's a weird thing when you think on it, right? Interesting. He said, did I commit a sin, by humbling myself? So these guys came in all proud and cocky, right? All self-confident that I have all you need, that kind of thing. And that attracts people because so many times people have no confidence. But you have to be careful. It's a red flag anytime anyone is in constant bragging motion about what they've accomplished and what they've done, right? Because those of us that are his know that if anything good's happened, God, we're going to give you the glory for it, right? Because we know it was you. It's interesting, isn't it? I know it is. It's the exact opposite of the world around you. But it's who he's called us to be. I don't know, it's interesting. So they came in talking about themselves, bragging about themselves, talking about all of their accomplishments. Paul came in not talking about any of them, but just wanting to share the truth with them. Interesting, right? Yeah, did I commit myself, ascend myself by humbling myself? We'll get to this at the very end, right? You might be exalted because I preach gospel to you, God's gospel to you free of charge, right? What does that mean? Well, Paul didn't take an offering. He didn't do anything when he was with them, right? In fact, Paul went on to say, listen, all right, I robbed other churches. That doesn't mean he stuck them up, right? But it says, I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. So in other words, Paul says, listen, I came in because I wanted you to understand the grace of the gospel. These guys are charging you for their speeches. They're charging you, they're telling you if you don't have them and it's not free and all the other stuff. But in order to understand what God's grace is, it's a gift you don't deserve. I wouldn't take anything from you. Interesting. Therefore, another telltale sign of characteristics of true leaders is that they're not going to be money-oriented or money-obsessed. Guys, that'll knock out about 75% of them on the television, right? Now, understand, you have to have support. But Paul got it from maturing churches who wanted to make a difference other places. Guys, this is missions 101, right? This is why you and I give to missions, because we want to invest in people who are sharing the gospel in other cultures. Well, this is what other churches were doing. Hey, Paul, we want to support you as you go start a church in Corinth, so that when you get there, you don't have to constantly be asking people there to support you, because then they'll start thinking, well, that's the only reason you're here. So you see then what he's talking about. So he says, and when I was with you and I was in need, I didn't burden not one person. Right? For the brothers came from Macedonia and brought the support that met my needs. Interesting. Guys, that's the way I do it around here. If you've noticed, I don't stand up here I'll tell you when we have financial needs, right? But I'm not going to manipulate you with weird stuff. I'm just not going to do it. I found out this, that if God lays it on our hearts, like this children's building, it's been absolutely amazing. If God lays it on your hearts to do it, then we're going to do it, right? But Lord help us. If he doesn't lay it on your heart, then I'm not going to go do it. Right? Does that make sense? Therefore, I'm depending and trusting on God in your life and in my life. Why am I going to try to do it another way if it truly is all about him? Am I making sense to you? Therefore, it's about him in our lives, not about my leadership to see how much money I can get out of you. Lord, deliver me from that, right? That's what he's talking about, right? So I refrained, and I will continue to refrain from burdening you in any way. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be silenced in the regions of Achaia. And why? Because I don't love you? No, but because I do. God knows I do. So basically, Paul sees himself as an authority in their life. And this is something that they needed to hear. But I'm not going to ask you this question. Please don't respond to this question. But how many times, if you have children, right? Has any of them ever said to you, you hate me? Right? Please don't say anything. Well, of course they have, or probably. If they haven't said it to you, they've thought it. But that's usually because you had to do something that they needed you to do for them and not necessarily they wanted you to do. So it's doing what's best for someone, even if they don't see it for a while. This is what Paul's saying, because these super apostles had come in, and Paul doesn't really love you, because if he did, he would give you what you want, kind of thing, right? It's a lie. He says, and why? He says, because I don't love you? No, it's because God knows I love you, right? And what I am doing, I will continue to do. In order that in order to undermine the claim of those who would like to claim that in their boasted mission, they work on the same terms as we do. They do not. And then Paul gets real personal, all right? For such men are false apostles, all right? They're fake. They're deceitful workmen. In other words, they're telling you that they're here to help you, but in reality, they're not. Look at the next one. They're disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. Now, what's a disguise? What does it mean to disguise? Well, when you put on a disguise, is that you are trying to portray yourself as something that you're not. Basically, to disguise yourself is hypocritical. You're trying to hide your identity and make yourself appear as someone else. Now, if you put on a disguise and you look like yourself, it's not a very good disguise. All right, you can't call it. I mean, I came up with that on my own, by the way, right? But I just love sharing just the simple, right? All right, just letting you see it. And then he makes a claim. He says, and no wonder, for even Satan himself disguises himself as an angel of light. You know, you hear what he's saying about these false apostles. You know, guys, these things that we call satanic, you know, these fringe areas where it's evil, guys, that is not what is the most dangerous. The most dangerous is the masquerade, right? It's the saying enough truth to get people to listen to you, but then go in other directions. This is what Paul called them. And these were people that were saying they were ambassadors for Christ, right? So anyway, not even Satan disguised himself. Look at this. So it's no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. And then he says their end will correspond to their deeds. Basically, Paul says there, I wouldn't want to be them one day, right? Now, this is where I'll close today. But this will kind of segue into what I want to. Dustin's going to be here next week, but in 2 weeks, this will segue into the next chapter, and it's real important. But it's called Power Through Humility. And this is where I'll close. But as a believer, I want you to hear this, because this is not natural in the world in which you and I live. Most people look at power and strength, you know, through self-confidence and working hard and all those things. And I get some of those things. Some of those things are not all bad. But what he's talking about here, Paul is sharing something with us that I want you to understand, right? I just want you to understand. If you think it ridiculous, that's not for me, then great, but at least you've understood. But what does it mean, power through humility? When you hear people talk about self-confidence, I find it incredible that in order to be used by God, you have to have no confidence in yourself. That's crazy, isn't it? So it's the exact opposite of what our world tells you. Why? Because those who have confidence in themselves, here we go, they begin to trust themselves. And so how can you trust God and yourself at the same time? Right? So the person that loses faith in themselves learns to put more faith in him. So let me tell some of you in the room that are very talented, intelligent, smart people, right? It's okay, God can still use you. You think I'm kidding? He just has harder work to do to teach you not to trust yourself. I hope you're hearing me. It's what he's going to talk about over these next verses. It's the exact opposite of what the world around you tells you. Interesting, huh? Interesting. Let's take a look at it, right? I repeat, let no one think me foolish, all right? But even if you do, accept me then as a fool. I think that's classic, all right? So that too I may boast a little. What I'm saying with this boastful confidence, all right, I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. Since many boast according to the flesh, that is according to their sinful nature, that is they brag about who they are and what they can do, I too will boast. For you gladly bear with fools. In other words, you put up with them, all right? Since you're so wise yourself, okay, there's a little sarcasm coming out here, all right? But you bear it if someone makes a slave of you. In other words, you're putting up with that. Why not put up with that? Right? They also, or they devour you, or they take advantage of you. You're just putting up with it. He goes, or they put on airs. What is putting on airs? Right? It's basically, walking around. You've seen people, they walk around, and they've got this thought in their mind of what they think everybody else is thinking about them. And they're trying to act like a big shot, like they are somebody. And so what happens is, Paul is saying, you're putting up with acting like that, right? And you're almost agreeing. How is that possible? This is what he's saying. I just want you to understand it. He says, so you bear with it, or you put up with it when they put on airs, or they strike you in the face, right? To my shame, I must say we were too weak for that, right? But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that. And then he goes on to talk about some of the claims they made. Because they would come in and make all kinds of boasts about who they were and what they were doing and different things. And Paul I think Paul hates to do this, but he kind of runs down the list and he says, listen, he says, are they Hebrews? Well, so what? So am I. He said, are they Israelites? Well, guess what? That's what I am. Are they the offspring of Abraham? Well, so what? That's what I am too. Are they servants of Christ? Question mark. Well, I'm a better one. I think that's classic. Right? I'm talking like a madman. In other words, Paul is to the point, I think he even hates talking about this. He says, with far more, if you will, far greater labors, far more imprisonments, countless beatings, and often near death, Paul says. And he goes on to recount. Now, this is interesting. I'm going to let you in on something. Paul's going to say in a minute, if anyone boasts, let's do it the opposite of the way the world does. Let's not boast about our strengths. Let's boast about our weaknesses. Because it's in our weakness he can be strong. This is weird, isn't it? See, it's what it's you have to have, for those of you who have ears to hear, you have to be able to get this piece, right? So Paul goes down this whole litany of weaknesses and failures, right? Oh, that's not according to the book of how you promote yourself, right? Yeah, let's take a look at it. Let's look at this. Here we go. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes less one. 5 times. If you don't know what that is, that's what happened to Jesus before the cross. These cat of 9 tails, or if you will, these long leather strips with pieces of glass and bone tied to the ends, and you'd receive 39 of those lashes. So Paul is saying that's happened to me 5 times, right? 3 times I've been beaten with rods. Those are basically bamboo, little thin bamboo. It's just basically a whip, right? All right. Once I was stoned, right? We're not talking about drugs here, right? We're talking about actual stones. That actually is in the book of Acts, all right? 3 times I was shipwrecked, all right? He said, one of those times I was shipwrecked, I spent a day and a night adrift. Well, what's Paul talking about? He says, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, in danger from robbers, okay, in danger from my own people, in danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the country or wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, right? In toil, hardship, through many sleepless nights, in hunger, thirst, often without food, and cold, exposure, and apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me from all my anxiety from all the churches. Now, notice that Paul here, and I want you to hear, he does this on purpose, so there's something you and I need to learn from it. He's not talking about all of his successes. He didn't say, you know how many churches I've started? You know how many poor people I've helped, and brag. Because understand this, if you're his, right? If you're his, then as we trust him and he works through us, our desire is for God to receive the glory, right? But there's a fine line between that. I mean, it's like the old joke, you know? Sometimes believers are real good at giving God all the glory, but then taking all the credit, right? But what does it mean what is true humility? Not the fake kind, but what is true humility that's being talked about here? It's understanding that whatever good has happened, Lord, you've given me the strength to do it. And the only reason I've been able to do it is because, Lord, I've trusted you. And the only way I can trust you is to stop trusting myself so much. For those of you who have ears to hear. But you're going to battle with that. That's why Paul's talking about it, because they battle with it in their culture also. You're going to battle with that in his culture, because this is definitely not what our culture is going to share with you, right? Who is weak and I am not weak, right? Who is made to fall and not indignant? If I must boast, here's what Paul said. That's why I told you about it ahead of time. If I'm going to boast in the things that show my weaknesses, right? That's not how most people brag. In fact, it's a red flag to me in the spiritual area when I have people start bragging. Huge red flag. Because the more you brag, the more you're telling everybody I'm trusting in myself. Interesting, huh? And Paul, perhaps the greatest believer who ever lived, if I can even put it in those terms. How was it that God used Paul so much? It's because Paul was in so many situations that all he had was God. And you've been there enough, and God's worked in your life like that, you stop trusting yourself. I don't want to risk trusting myself here, Lord. I'm going to trust you here completely. But guys, you learn that. You don't come up with that on your own. You say, Lord, I don't know what to do here. In all your ways, acknowledge him. He'll make your path straight. This is what he's talking about. I'm going to brag in the weak areas. Why? Because Paul was a talented guy. A lot of these things happened in Paul's life. You're going to find out in the next chapter, there's this thing called a thorn in the flesh. It was a physical malady that Paul had. And Paul found out that the reason he had it was so that it would keep his trust in who God was, so God could still keep using him. Isn't that interesting? That's next time. And then my grace is sufficient. That's all next time. Again, it's incredible. All right? The God and Father of our Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, he knows that I'm not lying, basically, he says. And then he goes on to share a story in Damascus, how that King Aretas was after him, and he was able to escape through a window in the wall, right? And he's just standing as God in every situation, right? Every situation, God's delivered me. I'm going to keep trusting him. So, as I close, I got to be done. But isn't that interesting? I just wanted you to see it. The authentic is not what we can do, that's on the outside, but who he's called us to be. And when he is at work in those of you that are his, it is unmistakable, right? It's unmistakable. But don't be duped, right, into this world's idea of what it means to be a good Christian. Lord, if you want an education, right, just go ask somebody, what's a good Christian? They're going to give you more weird stuff. But it all has to do with like doing good works, right, and helping people, whatever. But listen, you and I don't help others, right, because it comes from us. Right? We've learned that I've found that you help others because he's made the difference in your life. And the more one becomes like Christ, the more desire you will have to truly care about others, more than yourself. And that's just something he's at work doing. And it becomes who you are as opposed to just what you do. Again, for those of you who have ears to hear.